Hello again, it's Morales with Chapter 38.1, Part 2, Formation of the Bipolar World. Understand how the Cold War was played out, and understand how the Cold War impacted the U.S. and other places. So, let's start by going to Cuba. We already took a look at some of the earlier Cold War events, like the Berlin airlift and the Berlin Wall. Okay. Here's Cuba. Cuba is an island 90 miles off the coast of Florida, and it turns communism. This guy named Castro comes in and he institutes a communist insurgency revolution in Cuba in 1959, essentially taking it over from U.S. companies that were kind of running the show with a leader named Bautista, okay, who was not a nice guy. He was nice for the American companies, but not so much for his own people. Castro right away ends up promising to cancel cancel the promised election, sets himself up as kind of the dictator. Had they had the election, he would have won because the people hated the old leader and definitely liked him much better. And then he takes over the property, nationalizes the sugar plantations and other areas and those things, and sets up a communist dictatorship in the area. The U.S. responds by imposing a trade embargo, cutting off Cuba from all trade. This hurt some U.S. companies because they had a big business going in there, but they also were hurt by the fact that Castro took away the stuff. The Soviets, looking for allies, especially in the Western Hemisphere, quickly move in and start to provide support for the Cuban Revolution by giving them lots of financial help and also some commercial help in the form of grain so that they could feed their people. There's an incentive, obviously strings attached, and the Soviets want to be friendly with the Cubans so that they can use Cuba as kind of leverage against the U.S. possible attack. The United States, very unhappy with the situation, institutes this thing called the Bay of Pigs, which is a major fiasco in U.S. history. But essentially, Kennedy is the president, just newly elected, and he's at that time their youngest president, so already people are down him because young people do dumb things and make mistakes, and they're afraid that he's the president, he might make a mistake, it could end the world. So in the Bay of Pigs, on the advice of his advisors, but it's still his call, he institutes what's called the Bay of Pig invasions, in which they're going to be people who left Cuba, taken away from Castro, basically people with some wealth and clout, want to take Cuba back, and they promise the president and the directors of the CIA that if they get there, the people of Cuba are going to be so happy to see them because life in Cuba under Castro is terrible, that the people will rise up and rebel with them and take Cuba back, essentially move it away from communism. The plan is not accurate. The people that were setting it up, the Cubans who were in exile, did not have the overwhelming support. So here's a picture of the Cuban exiles who went back to try to take back Cuba, who got attacked by the locals and taken over, and the support didn't happen, being held captive in this area. So Kennedy and the CIA, that's our Central Intelligence Agency, our spy group, help out these 1,500 Cubans to try to set up this revolution. It doesn't happen. They're supposed to land in this place called the Bay of Pigs, that's where the name comes from, and set up a revolution. It doesn't happen. The American air support is also a fiasco because they drop supplies off to the wrong place, and within just a couple of 3 days, mainly the first day, but the other 3 days of rounding up some people who are stragglers, the insurrection is put down very quickly. This embarrasses the U.S., so although they say they weren't involved, it's very clear that they were because of the support and the fact that these are Cuban exiles who had just happened to be living in Florida for the most part. It makes JFK, the young president, look bad, and it scares people because he looks like he's incompetent. The next thing is the Bay of Pigs. I'm sorry, this is a Cuban Missile Crisis. I should say that instead of Bay of Pigs. But there's a picture right here that shows. Here's Cuba, and this circle right here shows the range that could be reached by a medium-range ballistic missile. Okay, and then the IRBM is the intercontinental ballistic missile, which is a longer range ballistic missile. So essentially this one I think is within 45 minutes or so. Okay, it could be shot from here and reach anything within that target. So you notice Washington D.C. and Dallas are in this mix. Okay, well, if Cuba had nuclear weapons, but where would they get atomic bombs or nuclear weapons? They don't have the technology for their... Oh, wait a second. Who does? Russia has. And so this scares the snot out of people because they fear that the Russians might put weapons on there, and then we find that there's our spying mission, which the U.S. wasn't supposed to do, but they did anyways, reveals that they're building missile silos, places to shoot the missiles from, on the island of Cuba. America has to respond because they don't like this threat being so close by. And this is the Cuban Missile Crisis, and this is considered by many the closest we've ever come to the big war, the World War III. October 1962, the Soviets got caught putting the missiles in there. Like I said, we had spy planes that took pictures of it and revealed the situation. Kennedy, at first secretly, calls the Russians, and the Russians say, "We don't know what you're talking about." Then he publicly calls them out and showing the pictures. Okay, and then the Russians go, "Oh, those nuclear missiles on Cuba. We thought you meant something different," and they end up kind of looking bad. The problem is that there's some ships headed from Russia towards Cuba, and we think that those ships have the actual weapon part of the missile. The missile's already in Cuba, but it doesn't have the blow-up part, the nuclear part element that's coming. So the U.S. then quarantines Cuba, which is surrounded with ships, and makes it sure that nothing gets in or out, in particular in. And this is called a blockade, not a blockade, but a blockade. Okay? I'm sorry, it's called a quarantine, not a blockade, because a blockade is considered an act of war. But a quarantine, which is the same thing, just with a different name, is acceptable. The Soviets then concede after long deliberation and 4 days of people watching and waiting and hoping something good would happen. People literally going, "Oh my gosh, we're going to die in 3 days, in 2 days, in 1 day." Oh, finally they came up with a solution. And the United States and the Soviet Union decided to come up with kind of a deal that the U.S. would not try to take over Cuba and not invade, and for that the Russians would pull the missiles out of Cuba. Also, part of a secret deal was that that the U.S. would get rid of some missiles that we have in Turkey that are pointed at Russia. This goes down as, like we said, the closest it's come to war. And then Dean Rusk, who's the Secretary of State at that time, says they were eyeball to eyeball. They blinked first. So it's one of those macho contests. And in this case, the U.S. wins, and Kennedy now looks a little bit better, competent. The Cold War goes on to what we said, the bipolar world. So if you take a look at the purple, those are the NATO nations that are allied, and then the lighter blue are any other nations that, like Iran and Pakistan, who are allied with the U.S., friendly towards the U.S. The Russians have the orange and the kind of lighter orange, okay, and those groups. It creates a situation where all countries, for the most part, are going to have to decide whether they're with the U.S. group or the USSR, thus creating our bipolar world. Within the United States, the fear of communism spreading kicks in with the Red Scare that happens in the 1950s, in the search that, or in the fears that that communism is spreading within the United States. And this is essentially what some people go down, domestic containment. So in this case, we have this wonderful senator. He's not. I detest him. Senator Joseph McCarthy, who starts to accuse people of being communists. We're not completely sure because he never tells us straight out. But there's a lot of evidence to point out that his accusations were completely fake and made up things just to get him elected. Like I'm going to stop the communists. I'm going to stop the communists. I got a list of all these people who are communists, and I'm going to go after them. Well, people hear that, they don't look and check their information because that would be silly, and they just believe them, and he gets this big fluff going on, and people are very scared. And this is part of the HUAC, the HUAC, where they're going to call into questions some people and ask them, "Are you or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?" And then you're doomed, because if you say no, well, obviously you're lying because you're a communist. If you say yes, well, you're dumb, and therefore you're a communist. And then if you say nothing, well, the only reason you would say nothing is because you are a communist, so you're damned either way. Also within the U.S., the Cold War also helps to kick in or give another push to feminism, the idea that women should be equal and set on the same level, get the same pay, same situation as men. Women are pressured to leave the workforce in World War II. Like I said before, although they're pressured to leave, they don't completely leave. They do take not as the lesser jobs, in other words, more maintenance type of job and for less pay, but they didn't leave the workforce completely. Then in 1950s, Betty Friedan writes this book called The Feminine Mystique, and it's basically critiquing the situation that the U.S. Kind of implores women to be stay-at-home mothers. That's what the culture tells them, and that they should be very happy with that situation. Well, Betty Friedan's a very smart woman, and she says, I'm as smart as my husband or as competent as my husband, so I should be able to have a career. And this society puts me in a situation where that makes me feel quite guilty. And she says that many women are not happy with this idea of being the perfect stay-at-home mom, like the June Cleaver that was mentioned. Also, the Cold War kicks in or helps to emphasize the civil rights movement, because here's the irony. The United States is stopping the spread of communism and advocating that the democracy should spread, and we should protect democracy and freedom abroad. Well, the U.S. doesn't give democracy to a certain group of people, in particular blacks. So the U.S. is asking blacks to fight for freedom of the Koreans, of the Vietnamese, but at home, these blacks don't have full rights. They're discriminated, they're picked on, Jim Crow, segregation, anti-voting legislation, all the stuff that's created, and here you are asking that same group of people who are repressed in America to go fight for the freedoms of some people far, far away. Some of it doesn't quite match up, and this helps to kick in the situation that's going to happen in the 1950s of the rise of Martin Luther King and his push for civil rights. And once again, King is the one that's emphasized or influenced by Gandhi and the idea of passive resistance, to willingly violate a rule or law that you think unjust to be a sign of protest. They know it's going to be a slow, gradual process. So the big step is Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which says that school segregation is inherently unequal. That as soon as you separate, you make it unequal, and therefore that can't. Well, that's the first big step to knocking down these barriers for racial discrimination. And of course, you guys know the Rosa Parks story. She sat on the bus and then didn't refuse to move, and that was wrong. So that's going to challenge the discrimination laws. The only problem is, anytime they want to change the law, they have to do it one by one. They can't just say stop discrimination. So, well, because many groups are saying, well, you didn't say this discrimination or that discrimination. They're really good at finding the excuses, kind of like teens. Consumerism is a big factor, and kids are going, how is consumerism tied to communism or the Cold War? Well, remember, consumerism is based on capitalism. People need to buy in order for capitalism to succeed. So you create, the need for, why do women have to have 50 pairs of shoes? They can't wear them all. Well, they have to have 50 pairs of shoes because of consumerism, because those jobs and factories and stuff are driven by that. So this helps create a situation where at home it's going to be played out in a couple ways. In particular, after into the 1950s and into the post-war era, America is going to become this very, very affluent society. It's going to have the highest standard of living by far, and much of it driven by consumerism spreading. And this creates the idea of the American dream, that you can have the house with all the gadgets, kind of like the kitchen debate, okay, which is going to help to spread this idea into Europe, that Europe wants to be more American-ish, where they have access to all those consumer goods. And this is reinforced by the Marshall Plan, which is the U.S. spending $13 billion, not to be repaid, but to rebuild Europe, okay, as an investment into making the European infrastructure stronger, so that they can build factories, so they can create jobs, so that those people who have jobs and can buy stuff, in particular American stuff. This helps to stall the spread of communism, because people who are wealthy or have some wealth and affluence and means, they don't turn communism. It's poor people that want to turn to communism because they don't have much. This is emphasized, or this consumerism is emphasized in the Europeans' car ownership. So in 1955, 5 million cars. By 1963, just 8 years later, there are 44 million cars, many of them American cars, being sold in Europe. So this increases the profits for American companies and helps to trim down the spread of communism. Next element is the space race, and this is the kind of nonviolent aspect, but it's set up with the violence or the possibility of war in it. Okay? The initial Soviet successes, in 1957 they launched Sputnik, and it's the first satellite to successfully orbit the moon. And then in 1961 they sent Yuri Gagarin, the first man to orbit the moon. And people are shocked, because how can the Russians do that? You told us they weren't as smart, weren't as advanced. Well, they beat the Americans at this. So America has to get back, and they create NASA with the #1 mission of to get a man on the moon before the Russians. Okay, and they eventually do. But the thing is, hey, we got to the moon, but there's no value in it. That's the end of part